2014 was an insane year for games. We saw the beginnings of many influential franchises like Destiny, Titanfall, Shadow of Mordor, to personal favorites of mine like South Park: The Stick of Truth and Tales from the Borderlands. Looking back, a lot of these titles were expected to become long-time favorites, but like a burst of fireworks, the ones that were thought to be the pinnacle of gaming and were expected to go on for a long time have unfortunately faded into memory. But 2014 also produced a few surprises of its own, and today we'll be focused on one particular indie game that a lot of people at the time would have hastily discarded as just a trend. Developed by Scott Cawthon as a last attempt at game development after his previous game failed, Five Nights at Freddy's became a cultural phenomenon, which only kept rising to new heights when creators like Markiplier and PewDiePie were making content on the game. I played the first game with some classmates, and it was a ton of fun trying to beat the game and scaring our asses off. The concept of haunted animatronics at a pizza place was absolutely brilliant, and it was definitely one of the more original approaches to a common trope of mixing childlike things like toys or songs and then twisting them into something really unsettling and can be downright terrifying. Now in 2024, this simple indie game has grown into a behemoth of a franchise. But I argue it's suffering from something that might make this growth a little unsustainable in the future. Or worse, will make it hated by the very fans that have loved it for a long time. To explain this, we need to trace back its history and discuss what built Five Nights at Freddy's and what sets it apart from other indie titles. So far, we've gone over how the first game went, and with its overwhelming success, we can now move on to the sequel, which would naturally be in place. And Scott didn't waste any time releasing Five Nights at Freddy's 2 just 4 months later. When this game succeeded, the third game came out 3 months after that, and then the fourth game 4 months after that, giving us 4 mainline games in the span of a year more or less, which is an insane output for a lone developer. The mechanics of these games aren't too different, which alone would have made the experience a little repetitive, but what's good is that now there are new characters to work with, new locations, new settings. All of these serve one of, if not the single most important aspect that made the franchise so successful. Following an approach that's similar to From Software's, Scott leaves tidbits of information in every game for players to interpret, dissect, and debate about on what exactly is happening in the story, and what the timeline of events are. As someone who's engaged immensely with Souls lore myself, I completely understand how this type of storytelling can create such an engaged community. There are a ton of lore videos, blogs, discussions on Reddit. All of these formats keep discourse about the game alive and allow players a reason to stay invested in the games, as now there's something beyond survival that we can pay attention to as we play them. Now, it's no doubt that the lore is a core reason for the fans' commitment since the early games, but there are a number of things that the franchise did and continues to do that further accelerates its rise. One example of this is when Scott released FNAF World shortly after the fourth game. There was a lot of heat generated by this title because at the time, people either loved or hated it. This outcome was understandable because it takes a more mellow approach to the beloved characters, with new gameplay and a more cutesy aesthetic that naturally feels like a jarring transition from the previous 4 games. It was also clearly rushed, having so many problems, whether it was the gameplay itself, the interface, the look of the characters, the graphics. It took so many updates before it actually felt playable, and eventually Scott even had to make it free to calm the outrage. The game after that would also be a hard pill to swallow for some fans. In 2016, Scott released FNAF Sister Location, which is set in a, sister location to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Many would say that this was a more underrated title due to its story-driven nature, while others criticized that same aspect, as the scripted sequences and long bouts of exposition don't really encourage replayability. Despite this divisive reception for both games, we could kind of observe how Scott was really thinking about how to innovate on the franchise and experiment with newer genres and approaches to the lore, which, regardless on where you stand on this debate, allowed the franchise to appeal to a wider audience. You see, at the time, I played every FNAF game until the 4th one, and by this point I was kind of tired of the gameplay, and I'm not the only one with this sentiment, as the games were getting a little repetitive. FNAF World was honestly too weird of a transition for me, and I didn't revisit the series again until I found out that for some reason, Shaggy from Scooby-Doo and Peeta from the Hunger Games were in it now. But we'll get to that later. The point is that there might have been fatigue setting in for some players for the first 4 games, and so there was a need to shake things up. And man, did Scott shake, spawning a bunch of alternative formats such as the aforementioned FNAF World. We also got Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, where you have the restaurant management stuff to worry about along with surviving. Ultimate Custom Night was also a cool game where you got the custom night that you could do in previous games, but now with a shit ton of characters to work with. You also got Freddy in Space, which is another big jump in genre. Like, you get the idea, right? There were a lot of attempts to really change things up and make things a little bit more interesting. This is further supported by how at this time, VR was starting to get some traction, and in 2019, we got FNAF Help Wanted, the franchise's first dip into VR. This entry knocked it out of the park and is the first game that Scott co-developed with Steel Wool Games, who'll play an important role as we'll see later. Although technically this is a remade port of the first games, it is an incredibly well-made port with a lot of extras added into it. Plus, the gameplay translates really well to VR, making it a good way to experience the game for old and new fans alike. Rather than reusing assets from the first game and adding a 3D environment to it, the devs instead created new assets for the game, which would create a whole new experience and breathe new life into the original games, which I think was an amazing step for the franchise. Now, with Help Wanted's success, it seemed like Steel Wool would show a lot of promise for the way it takes the franchise moving forward. But unfortunately, this journey wasn't as rosy as people would think. This leads us to our next title, Security Breach, which is thus far the title with the highest peak of players, at least based on data from Steam. For comparison, the title with the highest peak released prior to Security Breach was Sister Location at around 3,500 concurrent players, which isn't bad. But during its month of release, Security Breach peaked at around 11,000 players, which is 3 times the size of Sister Location. Granted, this doesn't include other platforms, which could definitely skew the numbers a bit, but my point here is that Security Breach was one of the most hyped releases for the franchise, and this hype likely spread to include newer players, as there were a lot of things promised in the trailers, and nobody really doubted Steel Wool's ability to execute due to their success with the VR title. But unfortunately for the devs and the fans, Security Breach did not really come out as expected, at least not on launch, and nobody could have predicted just how it would impact the franchise for better and also for worse. In terms of the positives, the number of players we discuss could illustrate some growing interest in the franchise. From a business perspective, of course, this is all good because more players means more growth and revenue for the series. And also from the fans' point of view, this means that the community is also growing larger, with more people interacting and engaging with this content. The only problem with this is that many fans, especially older ones, were not super happy with the finished product. Now, we briefly discussed how Sister Location was also quite divisive at the time. However, we never really went into depth, did we? One of the main reasons that Sister Location was divisive was how the game felt out of place, not just in terms of gameplay, but also in terms of lore, as it did start to go down a more sci-fi route with the introduction of Remnant, and also its representation of Afton and his intentions. This is an important point because a lot of fans tend to mark this as a landmark for when the series started to go in weird directions. To be fair, the other games might have exposed this sentiment as well, but it was definitely hammered home with the release of Security Breach. Security Breach's divisiveness makes Sister Location's debates seem a little minor in comparison, but this was because the hype was at unprecedented levels for this game. Aside from the rough gameplay at launch, which definitely outraged a lot of players, many older fans were also unhappy with how the game doesn't execute on the lore in any meaningful way, and how the series seems to be delving away from its horror roots. But this is argued against by others in the community, with many players enjoying the new gameplay, criticizing older fans for being too close-minded and critical about the game, and blaming the other fans who were pressuring and harassing Steel Wool to release it when it wasn't even complete. This was worsened by how fans were also divided on how much either Scott or Steel Wool are responsible for how the final product turned out. especially after the whole controversy surrounding Scott's political beliefs that essentially pushed him to distance himself from the game dev side of the franchise. There are obviously a lot of gray areas here, a lot of sides, a lot of theories, and with newer fans, especially a younger audience joining the FNAF community, things could definitely become a little heated. But the main issue here is now there seems to be a lot of confusion as to where this franchise is going. Who is it appealing to? And during times of failure or mixed reception, who's to blame for it? And the funny thing is that the launch of Security Breach was only the beginning. If you thought those opening numbers were impressive, what if I told you that it wasn't even the highest peak? About 1.5 years after release, Security Breach's numbers will skyrocket, accompanied by another boost to the numbers for the other entries as well. The first reason is, of course, the release of Security Breach's DLC, Ruin, which was definitely a much better experience and shows that Steel Wool definitely had the capacity to execute on their vision, which, due to a number of factors, didn't really translate into the launched product. But this rise is also further supplemented by a second factor, which is arguably another big jump in terms of direction for the franchise. I don't think it's wrong for me to say that this was the point that Five Nights at Freddy's had become a worldwide phenomenon once again, and this time bringing in so much more clout for the franchise than it had ever experienced before. Security Breach had reached a peak of around 17,000 concurrent players on Steam during the weeks after the trailer and the DLC dropped, which is leagues above any numbers it saw before. Not even Help Wanted 2, which launched a few months later, would have similar numbers, despite being a sequel to an arguably more beloved entry in Steel Wool's catalog. As for the movie, it was a commercial success, becoming the highest grossing horror film in 2023. That said, this movie did not review well. As far as adaptations go, I wouldn't say it's the worst, but it did receive a lot of criticism. Now, there are a lot of strong points that I could highlight, like how it made a lot of references to the games, how it starred Josh Hutcherson and Matthew Lillard with a cameo from MatPat as well, and even how it has a sequel lined up already to a trilogy that would keep fans coming back. But one of the major shortcomings that I think many fans can agree with, is that the movie was not scary. There were almost zero jump scares, which is such an odd thing when that's the quintessential identity of FNAF's horror, along with the dread and tension. So it's very surprising that this wasn't even included. Some people thought that it should have been rated R, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but the movie could have definitely taken a darker approach. You can see that there's a pattern here. This is now becoming a dominant theme for many older fans' criticisms for later entries, in that the franchise is shifting too much away from its horror roots. But looking into the fans' perspective on the movie is just one side of the coin. As of the time of writing, the trailer for the movie is at about 43 million views. Even if just 10% of those views are people who watched the movie, and only 10% of that are new fans or players, that still gives us a pretty sizable increase in exposure for the series, as it's likely that people who watch the movie and feel intrigued about the lore will bring themselves to the other games and content to explore this in depth. This might also include a hybrid form of fan like myself, who are people who were into the initial games, but kind of dropped it somewhere along the way. With this though, we can now look back at these events and dissect two trends. First, with each iteration, moving from Sister Location to Security Breach, from FNAF World to Custom Night, and even from the games in general to the big screen, you can kind of visualize how the franchise has grown much larger than any indie game we've seen before in terms of its catalog and, of course, its fan base. But also, we can observe that it keeps repeating and reintroducing the same issue, where it can't make up its mind on what approach it should take, whether in terms of tone, gameplay, or lore, which I argue is what's causing so much of the divisiveness and is what alienates a lot of longer-term fans. For the past 10 years, the series has been flip-flopping between various approaches and genres. Now don't get me wrong, it's not bad to continue trying to innovate, especially since a lot of the whimsical ones are to enhance the lore surrounding the Fazbear business. It's also probably why many new players are getting into the series up until now, as they get introduced through a medium that they're attracted to. But it does leave existing players, those who are here the longest, with a constant state of whiplash, where one game sticks to its dread-inducing roots, another game markets itself more to kids, one game is more gameplay heavy, the next one is going to be more narrative focused, one game is more humorous in tone, and then the next one makes you shit your pants. The franchise is basically like the MCU at this point, where it's on the fence about whether it should take itself and its world seriously, or if it should drop another one-liner or meme to make itself relatable to newer audiences. If you don't believe me yet, just this August, Five Nights at Freddy's just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, and with this came the release of 2 games. The first is one of the more outstanding outcomes from this month, and is another game that pursued a new medium for the franchise once again, and that is Into the Pit. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this game is super fun. The franchise, through the amazing work of Mega Cat Studios, has created a successful venture into new territory that doubles down on the core themes of horror and dread that popularized the OG games with a new kind of twist to it. So great, we've got a good return to form with a new medium but retaining the original tone that many people love. But then the second game they release is a demo announcing Five Laps at Freddy's, a Mario Kart inspired racing game with a very jolly tone to it, making it go the opposite direction compared to Into the Pit, with Click Team at the helm for this title, the ones responsible for the mobile ports for most of the previous games. Now, I'm not saying that Five Nights at Freddy's can't do a Mario Kart-like title. Hell, it's actually kind of fun after I tried it, and I realized this may be a good way to cleanse the palate somewhat. But then again, where are we going with this exactly? A lot of people assume it's a fake out, but others just want a fun little racing game. I'm personally more confused about it, but I'll wait for the full release to see what's really going on. In the end though, going strong for 10 years is a phenomenal feat. Scott should be proud of the franchise he's built because it means that there are a lot of great things here that people keep coming back to. But is this going to be sustainable in the next years? The answer may lie in the ones who keep any gaming franchise alive, and that's the fanbase. And the amazing thing is that this fanbase is incredibly dedicated and resilient. There are a lot of fan games, music, art, lore discussions being made, but also there are a lot of controversies and toxic experiences that fans have endured, and it's actually given the fandom a very cult-like reputation. But honestly, when you think about it, the toxic and wholesome aspects, despite creating opposite perceptions, can be found in any fanbase and are in fact rooted in the same love for the FNAF franchise. And personally, I feel really happy that indie games can reach a level like this, can have movies, can have multiple different genres. But the fact of the matter is, it can't be treated as an indie title anymore. It's too big for that. FNAF franchise's innovativeness has allowed it to grow its fan base and appeal to a lot of people, but now it comes with a responsibility to kind of keep that fan base satisfied, which involves making clearer decisions on where this franchise will go and what identity it will carve for itself in the gaming community. Of course, this is going to be easier said than done though, and many would argue that it's the fans who should make up their minds, and the reason I only kind of partially agree with that is that people will always be divided on opinions. They'll always have different tastes and perspectives on where this franchise should go. And the unfortunate reality is that this fan base is big enough that not all members will be civil about these differences. So now it's really up to Scott and the franchise's teams and devs to decide who they're making these games and even the movies for. They have to stick to that decision, and then they have to relay it as clearly as they can through their games or through whatever mode of communication is available. It might not necessarily be pretty, but at the very least, fans will have a better idea on where this franchise will be going moving forward, so that they can still decide on whether they'll stick to this, or maybe it's time for them to move on to another franchise. But that said, even if I'm just a minor fan compared to the incredibly dedicated players who might be watching this video, I'm in absolute awe in how far Five Nights at Freddy's has come. Although it's a little daunting for me to completely dive into what the series has to offer lore-wise and gameplay-wise, as I'm a little bit of a coward, I still applaud it for everything it's achieved, and I do wish the franchise a belated happy birthday. But that's it from me. Thanks for watching, and do let me know what you think about the franchise so far and where you think it's going. These are just my own opinions, of course, and I'd definitely love to hear what other fans think about where this franchise is now and where it's going. Leave a like and subscribe if you like what you see. This is Sai from Fireplace Gaming, and I do hope you're having a great one. Catch you later.